Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for April 13th, 2021. Today I'm going to talk to you about a word that is often thrown around, but very few people think about the real implications of its meaning. And that is the word genocide. What we're seeing now is a policy of deliberate population reduction coming from the Davos billionaires, their central bankers, as well as from the US, UK, NATO war hawk faction, engaging on two fronts. One is a continuation of wars and regime change, which are destroying nations and ruining the inability of sovereign nations to defend and protect their population. And at the same time, we're seeing deliberate efforts under the Great Reset and Green New Deal to continue the policy of radical depopulation, which has always been the intention of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. So let's take a look at these two processes, with the important point being that we have to intervene to stop this. The whole idea of looking at this as a genocidal policy is to rally support for defeating these policies and instead moving toward the development programs which can actually allow these sovereign nations to protect and defend their populations. Genocide technically means the deliberate destruction of an entire race or nation committed with intent. So let's take a couple of examples of a deliberate intent to kill. We'll start with, in the case of war, Yemen. Very few Americans are aware of what's going on there, but this is in part a proxy war of the Saudis against Iran. But beyond that, it's a war of population reduction. There's a civil war going on. The Saudis are blockading the ports. They're keeping food and medicine from the people of Yemen with the support of the US government, which has continued whether it was Donald Trump in power or Joe Biden. Biden has said he intends to stop the aiding of the Saudis militarily, but so far that's been meaningless. And if you don't stop them from conducting the warfare, what's the whole point of saying you're not going to send certain kinds of arms when we're continuing to back the Saudis with this push? There are now, according to David Beasley of the World Food Organization, 20 million people in Yemen who have not just food insecurity but face starvation. His call has been for aid to do something about this, repeated pleas from him. And there's been very small amounts of aid going in, but the blockade by the Saudis means it's not getting to the people. The intent of the civil war is to destroy the nation, and this has to be stopped. Now, second case, Syria. This began with the Syrian civil war that was fully backed by Barack Obama's administration, the arming of so-called moderate rebels, which was exposed by General Michael Flynn. The U.S. trained and backed the rebels, got them weapons from the Libyan operation where we destroyed a nation there for regime change, shipped those weapons through Turkey into Syria, and as a result you have millions of people displaced into refugee camps in surrounding countries, and hundreds of thousands killed. Now, on top of this, when the Russians came in and to some extent worked with the US military to defeat the ISIS caliphate, that is to knock out the predominant power of the ISIS and al-Qaeda forces in Syria, some of them remain in an area which is largely still protected. Now, after the Civil War, instead of rebuilding, Secretary of State under Trump, Pompeo, introduced something called the Caesar Act sanctions, which is another one of these fake stories concocted by British intelligence to convince the world that the problem in Syria is President Assad. Well, people were not fleeing Syria before the Civil War. Assad was reelected before the Civil War. There was no mass flight until the arms started coming in from the West. Now, the sanctions against Syria are continuing to be supported by the Biden administration Blinken, the Secretary of State, is a longtime proponent of regime change in Syria. And what Blinken and NATO are saying is that any country which aids Syria will be a target for sanctions. The Catholic nuncio, Cardinal Zenari, said there's no food, there's no medicine. 90% of the people of Syria are facing acute food shortages. Now remember, when Madeleine Albright defended the Bill Clinton sanctions against Iraq, 500,000 Iraqi children died, and Albright said that was a price that had to be paid to eliminate the Saddam Hussein regime. Well, that's unacceptable. People who say things like that should be put on trial for genocide. And now we have a situation where instead of providing support for reconstruction, we're continuing to inflict death and destruction on the Syrian people. Is this the rules-based order we hear Blinken and Pompeo lecturing the world about? Now, another case of war is Ukraine, where with full backing of Biden and NATO, the Ukrainian government is moving toward a provocation which could lead to a war with Russia, with shelling into villages in the breakaway ally republics in Donbass, with a full mobilization of Ukrainian military, with President Zelensky saying that Ukraine will take back Crimea. This is a straight-out provocation. How many people are going to die if the Ukrainian government is encouraged by Biden and NATO to continue their warlike posture towards their own people in eastern Ukraine? Furthermore, note, Biden was the original point man for Ukraine under the Obama administration when the regime change coup took place in February 2014. It's notable to look at what's being said about the expulsion or investigation and expulsion of so-called extremists in the U.S. military. We're doing that in the U.S. Do we not know that neo-Nazis are heavily embedded into the military and security forces in Ukraine, and yet we're giving them weapons? Again, where is the rules-based order? Now, the other case to look at is that of the Great Reset and Green New Deal, which is a continuation of a long-standing policy toward the developing sector. Either you accept conditionalities from Western banks, which means the debt payments come first, before food, before infrastructure, before hospital care, or else you get cut off from credit. Well, that's what the new bankers' dictatorship, which is coming into play under the Great Reset, will do with a coordinated central bankers' dictatorship. Take, for example, the World Bank IMF report that was released on March 26th, titled Debt Relief Under the Common Framework. Here's what it says. We must not lose sight of green and inclusive reforms while facing a debt crisis. In other words, the debt must be collected. Let's make the possibility of new credit or debt relief dependent on imposing green policies. So the solution is debt for climate swaps. You get debt relief if you close fossil fuel plants. That is, if you shut down the limited amount of electricity production that's available to some of the poorer countries in the world. This is in defense of the Paris net zero carbon policy, where pressure is being placed on private investors, on banks. There'll be no credit for coal or oil power and heating. No carbon-based industries such as steel, concrete, aluminum, which are necessary for infrastructure. No mechanized agriculture, no fertilizer for countries that are facing food shortages, unless you go with the full green policy. What's the message here? If you want credit, if you want debt reduction, reduce your population. That's why it's totally legitimate to say that this idea of global governance, of this new world order, is a commitment to killing off whole sections of the world's population. This was the intent of Henry Kissinger's 1975 National Security Study Memo 200. This is explicit in the Agenda 2030, which calls for sustainable development. Sustainable development in electricity and in energy means population reduction. And that's what the Davos billionaires stand for. That's what Mike Pompeo stood for. And that's now what the Biden administration is clearly backing with the Great Reset, the Green New Deal, and the push for sanctions against any government which rejects the idea of a rules-based order based on rules adopted by the City of London and Wall Street. Well, we're building a global anti-Malthusian resistance movement. There's already indication that a number of countries will reject the Great Reset and the Green New Deal, including India, Russia, and China. What about the American people? What about the people of Western Europe? Join the Schiller Institute. Become members of our organization. Join with us to educate people about the Malthusian genocide which is underway. Subscribe to our publications. The crimes of genocide are punishable by death as established by the tribunal at Nuremberg. I'm not calling for mass killings. What we're calling for is an end to these policies and a push for economic development. So thank you for joining me today, and join with us in this fight. I'll be back with you tomorrow.